"Don't move," the agent said, voice sharp enough to cut through the sirens, and the entire parking lot seemed to hold its breath as red and blue lights flickered across windshields and storefront glass, reflecting in the polished metal of a dozen parked cars, while Ava Carter stood still beside her old sedan, a plastic bucket and a pair of worn gloves resting on the asphalt near her feet. Her janitor uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift, the faint scent of industrial cleaner still clinging to her sleeves as if it had soaked into her skin, and yet her posture didn't match the moment, didn't match the fear in the air or the tension tightening every jaw around her, because while people whispered and stepped back and raised their phones just high enough to capture without getting involved, Ava simply inhaled slowly, steady, like someone counting time rather than losing it. And when the agent stepped closer, boots crunching softly over loose gravel, there was already something off about the scene, something too controlled in her stillness, too deliberate in the way her shoulders remained relaxed even as another officer circled behind her, the faint click of equipment echoing louder than it should have in the quiet. "Ma'am, hands where I can see them," the second voice added, less controlled, edged with impatience, and somewhere to the left a car door slammed, sharp and sudden, making a small child flinch near a shopping cart, the sound cutting through the moment like a crack in glass. But Ava didn't turn, didn't react, just lifted her hands slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, as if she were following a rhythm only she could hear, her fingers steady, her breathing unchanged, and for a split second, the lead agent, Daniel Hayes, noticed it, that absence of panic, that lack of resistance that didn't feel like surrender, more like observation, like she was measuring something invisible. "You understand what's happening here?" he asked, tone flat, procedural, but even as he spoke, his eyes narrowed slightly, tracking details most would miss, the way her stance balanced evenly, the way her gaze didn't dart or drop, but held forward, calm, grounded, while the second agent, Mercer, didn't bother with nuance, stepping closer with a scoff under his breath. "They always act confused," he muttered, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, and a few uneasy chuckles followed. Thin and uncertain, because no one wanted to be the one who spoke up. No one wanted to break the fragile distance between watching and being seen. And then the child's quiet whimper rose again, soft but sharp enough to cut through the noise, and Ava's eyes shifted just slightly, not turning her head, just enough to acknowledge. "Hey," she said gently, voice low and steady. "It's okay." And the words didn't belong in the chaos, didn't match the flashing lights or the rigid commands or the weight of authority pressing in around her. And that was when Hayes felt it again, that subtle misalignment, like a scene playing out of order, because people in her position didn't comfort others, they didn't slow down, they didn't speak like that. Not here, not now. And Mercer stepped in closer, impatience hardening into something sharper. "You don't get to talk right now," he said, reaching forward as if to force the moment back into control, back into something familiar. But Ava finally turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. And there was no anger there, no fear either, just clarity, sharp and quiet, like a line drawn in water that hadn't moved yet. "You're making a mistake," she said, and the words didn't rise, didn't challenge, they landed, calm and certain, and for the first time, the noise around them seemed to thin, like the air itself had stepped back to listen. Mercer's smirk lingered a second too long, like he had already decided how this would end, like the scene had already been written in his favor. But Ava did not move, did not raise her voice, did not shift her weight even as the flashing lights painted her face in alternating red and blue, each pulse revealing the same thing Hayes could not quite explain. Control, not the kind that comes from authority or force, but the kind that comes from certainty, and it unsettled him more than he expected. "A mistake," Mercer echoed, letting out a short laugh that did not carry far in the heavy air. "You people always say that." And somewhere behind them, a phone camera adjusted, zooming in just enough to catch her expression, waiting for it to crack, waiting for fear to surface, but it did not. It stayed steady, anchored, and that stillness began to stretch, thin and sharp, like a wire pulled too tight. "I need you to confirm your identity," Hayes said, more measured now, stepping slightly closer, his tone lower, quieter, as if he were trying to hear something beneath the surface. and Ava turned her gaze toward him, not defiant, not submissive, just direct. "You already have everything you need," she replied, and the words landed with a weight that did not match her uniform, did not match the plastic bucket sitting on the ground beside her car, did not match the narrative Mercer was so eager to force into place. "Then why are you not cooperating?" Mercer cut in, impatience rising again, his voice sharper now, pushing against the quiet that kept slipping out of his grasp, and Ava's eyes flicked toward him briefly, not reacting, just noting, like she was cataloging details, angles, timing, the kind of attention that does not belong to someone overwhelmed, and Hayes saw it, felt it settle into something heavier in his chest, something that made him hesitate half a second longer than procedure allowed, and in that half second, the world around them seemed to narrow, the distant traffic fading, the murmurs of the crowd thinning, leaving only the sound of breathing, slow and controlled on one side, uneven and tightening on the other. "You are detaining me without cause," Ava said calmly, each word precise, spaced, like she had said something similar before, like she knew exactly how it should sound, and Mercer shook his head, stepping closer again, trying to reclaim momentum. "We decide cause," he said, but it came out less certain than before, because something in her tone had shifted the ground beneath him, something he could not name but could not ignore, and then the child's voice returned, softer now. "Mom, is she in trouble?" And the question hung there, fragile and honest, cutting through layers of assumption and authority like it did not recognize either, and Ava's expression softened just slightly, just enough to be seen if someone was looking closely. "No," she said gently, without turning. "She is just being patient." And Hayes felt it then, clear and undeniable, the realization that this was not a situation escalating, but one being held back, contained, as if the person they believed they controlled had already decided how far this moment would go, and the only thing left uncertain was how long it would take for them to understand it. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, slowly, like pressure changing before a storm, and Hayes felt it in the way the crowd stopped whispering, in the way even the flashing lights seemed less chaotic and more rhythmic, like a clock ticking towards something inevitable, and Ava still stood there, hands visible, posture unchanged, her breathing steady enough that it became noticeable, almost distracting, because nothing about her matched the tension that Mercer kept trying to force. "Back into the moment, patient," Mercer repeated, his voice tightening, like the word itself irritated him, like it challenged something he did not want questioned, and he took another step closer, closing distance that no longer felt neutral. "You think this is about patience," he said, but Ava did not answer right away. She just watched him, not confrontational, not avoiding, just present, and that presence carried weight, the kind that made people aware of themselves, aware of how they were standing, how they were speaking, what they were assuming. And Hayes noticed Mercer shift his stance slightly, just enough to reveal that even he felt it, even if he would never admit it. "We are asking you to cooperate," Hayes said again, quieter now, choosing his words more carefully, because something in this situation no longer followed the script he knew, and Ava nodded once, small, controlled. "And I am," she replied, and there was no sarcasm in it, no resistance, just a statement that did not need to be defended, and that was when Hayes saw it clearly, the disconnect between what Mercer expected and what was actually happening, because cooperation did not always look like compliance, sometimes it looked like restraint, and that realization settled into him slowly, uncomfortable but undeniable, while Mercer exhaled sharply, running out of the easy confidence he started with. "You are standing here arguing," he said, but it sounded weaker now, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. And Ava's gaze shifted briefly toward the bucket near her car, the gloves resting beside it, small details that did not belong in a moment like this, and yet somehow anchored it, made it real in a way the flashing lights could not. "I finished my shift 10 minutes ago," she said calmly, and the sentence felt out of place, almost ordinary, but that was exactly what made it land, because it reminded everyone watching that before this moment, she had been invisible, just another person moving through the edges of their day, and now she stood at the center of it, not because she had changed, but because they had chosen to see her differently, and Hayes felt something tighten in his chest, a quiet awareness that the situation was no longer just procedural, It was personal, shaped by perception more than fact, and then he noticed it. The smallest detail, the way Ava adjusted her stance by half an inch. Not to move away, not to resist, but to balance, precise, deliberate, like someone who understood space in a way most people did not. And it clicked, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle him further, because that kind of control was not learned by accident. It was trained, repeated, refined over time, and Mercer saw the movement too, but misread it. Stepping forward again as if to reassert control. "Stay still," he said. Sharper now, but Ava had never moved, not in the way he meant, and that was when the moment shifted again, subtle but irreversible, because the longer she remained calm, the more their authority began to feel fragile, dependent on her reaction rather than their command, and Hayes realized, with a clarity that came too late, that they were not escalating this situation, they were being allowed to continue it. And the difference between those two things was about to matter. It happened in the smallest moment, the kind most people would miss, a shift so slight it barely disturbed the air, but Hayes saw it, the way Ava's fingers relaxed instead of tensed, the way her shoulders lowered by a fraction of an inch, as if something had just been decided, not out loud, not for anyone else, but within her, and suddenly the entire scene felt like it had crossed an invisible line, one that could not be stepped back over. "Last warning," Mercer said, his voice louder now, sharper, trying to reclaim ground that was already slipping, but the words did not land the same way anymore. They echoed, thin, stretched, like they were arriving too late, and Ava finally turned fully toward him, slow, deliberate, her movements measured not by fear, but by awareness, like she was choosing exactly how much of herself to reveal, and Hayes felt it immediately. The difference, because up until now she had been still, contained, almost blending into the role they had already assigned her. But now something else surfaced, not aggression, not defiance, something quieter, heavier, like a truth that had been waiting beneath the surface. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not challenge, it settled, firm and unmistakable. "You should stop," she said, and the words carried no threat, only certainty. The kind that does not ask to be believed, and Mercer scoffed, but it came out uneven, like his confidence had already begun to fracture. "Or what?" he asked, stepping closer again, closing the space that Ava had already accounted for, already measured, and Hayes saw it then, clear as daylight, the alignment of her stance, the balance in her footing, the way her eyes tracked movement not with panic but with precision, and a memory flickered in the back of his mind, something from training, something about presence, about people who carried themselves differently because they had been somewhere else, done something else, and for a second, just a second, he hesitated. "Mercer," he said quietly, but the warning came too late, not because anything had escalated yet, but because the moment itself had already shifted beyond his control, and then it happened, not fast, not chaotic, but exact, like a sequence unfolding the way it was always meant to. Ava stepped just slightly, not away, not forward, just enough to change the angle, enough to redirect the energy of the moment without force, without struggle, and Mercer stopped mid-motion, his expression changing not into fear, but confusion, because whatever he expected did not happen, and whatever did happen, he did not understand, and in that silence, that sudden, complete silence, the entire parking lot seemed to freeze. Phones held steady, breaths paused, even the distant hum of traffic fading into something distant and irrelevant, and Ava stood there, exactly where she had been, hands still visible, posture still calm, but everything about her was different now, not because she had changed, but because the truth of who she was had finally surfaced, impossible to ignore, impossible to reduce, and Hayes felt it settle into his chest like a weight he could not shake, the realization that they had never been in control of this moment, not from the beginning, not even now, and Ava looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, just clarity, steady and unshaken. "I told you," she said quietly. This was a mistake, and this time, no one laughed, no one moved, because the difference between assumption and reality had finally become undeniable. No one spoke at first, not because they were told to be quiet, but because something in the air had shifted beyond words, and Hayes felt it settle into the space between them, heavy and unmistakable, like a truth that had finally surfaced after being ignored for too long. And Mercer stood there, frozen in place, his expression no longer confident, no longer certain, just caught somewhere between disbelief and realization, as if the moment had slipped out of his control without him understanding how. And Ava remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her hands still visible, her breathing steady. But now there was no mistaking it, no misreading it. The calm she carried was not compliance. It was restraint, deliberate and chosen, and Hayes took a slow step forward, not to assert authority, not to escalate, but to understand, his voice quieter now, stripped of the edge it carried before. "Who are you?" he asked, and the question was not procedural anymore. It was personal, shaped by everything he had just witnessed, and Ava looked at him for a long moment, not avoiding, not confronting, just measuring whether the question deserved an answer. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained even, controlled. "Someone you should have listened to," she said, and the words did not carry anger, only clarity, and that made them land harder than anything louder ever could. And Hayes nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, because he knew she was right, not in a way that needed to be argued, but in a way that had already proven itself. And behind them, the faint hum of a police radio crackled, distant and irrelevant, because the real shift had already happened. And Mercer exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face as if trying to reset the moment, trying to pull it back into something familiar. "This is not over," he muttered, but the words lacked weight now, like they were spoken out of habit rather than belief. And Ava glanced toward him briefly, not dismissive, not threatened, just acknowledging, like she had already accounted for every possible outcome before this moment even began. And then her attention returned to Hayes, steady, grounded. "You enforce the law," she said quietly. "You should know it before you use it." And the sentence settled into the silence like a final piece clicking into place, simple, undeniable, and Hayes felt something shift inside him, not dramatic, not sudden, but real, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, just stays, reshaping what comes after. And for a second, the flashing lights reflected across Ava's face again. But this time they did not define her, they did not frame her as the center of a problem. They just passed over her, like everything else had before. And Hayes took another step back, not out of fear, but out of recognition, creating space where before there had been pressure. And Ava lowered her hand slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, just returning to stillness. And in that simple motion, the entire moment seemed to release, the tension easing, the crowd shifting, the quiet breaking just enough for the world to start moving again. And she bent down, picking up her gloves from the ground, the same worn pair she had set aside minutes earlier, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And that was the part that stayed with Hayes the most, not what she had done, but what she had chosen not to do, because whatever power she carried, she had never used it to dominate the moment, only to reveal it. And as she straightened, slipping the gloves back into her hand, she looked once more at the space where authority had stood so firmly just moments ago. And then she turned, walking away at the same steady pace she had always moved, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty, but understood. The sound of her footsteps was almost too quiet to notice, soft against the pavement as she walked away from the flashing lights, from the weight of eyes that had followed her only moments before. And yet now those same eyes did not chase her, did not question her. They just watched, uncertain, like they had missed something important and were only now realizing it. And Hayes stood still, his hands resting at his sides, no longer reaching, no longer directing, just present in a moment that no longer belonged to him. And the space she left behind did not fill immediately. It lingered, stretched, as if the air itself needed time to adjust to the absence of tension. And somewhere behind him, a voice crackled over the radio again, routine, procedural, asking for updates that suddenly felt distant, irrelevant, like they belonged to a different scene entirely. And Mercer shifted his weight, looking around as if searching for something to hold on to, something familiar. But there was nothing left to grab, no clear authority, no simple explanation. Just the echo of a moment that had quietly undone everything he thought he understood. "We cannot just let her walk," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, they lacked direction, lacked certainty. because he knew, even if he did not admit it, that stopping her now would not restore control. It would only expose how little they had ever had. And Hayes exhaled slowly, his gaze still fixed on Ava's back as she moved farther away, blending into the ordinary rhythm of the street, past parked cars, past storefront windows reflecting the fading emergency lights, until she looked like she belonged there again, like she had never been pulled into the center of anything at all. And that contrast settled into him deeper than anything else, because power was not supposed to disappear like that. It was supposed to dominate, to leave a mark, and yet hers had done the opposite. It had revealed, corrected, and then stepped back, leaving only clarity behind. And he turned slightly, scanning the faces of the crowd, noticing how quickly people lowered their phones, how conversations resumed in hushed tones, not excited, not entertained, just thoughtful, like they had witnessed something they could not easily explain. And the little girl who had cried earlier now stood quietly beside her mother, no longer afraid, just watching Ava walk away with a kind of quiet curiosity. And Hayes felt it again, that shift, not in the scene, but in himself, a recognition that this moment would not end when the lights turned off. It would stay, replaying in the spaces where certainty used to sit, reshaping the way he saw things he had never questioned before. And Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice now, almost hesitant. Who was she? He asked, and this time it was not a challenge, not a dismissal. It was a real question, stripped of assumption. And Hayes did not answer right away, because the truth was, he did not know fully, not yet, but he understood enough to know that the answer was not simple, not something that could be reduced to a file or a label or a quick report over the radio. And as Ava reached the far end of the lot, her figure nearly blending into the passing crowd, she paused for the briefest second, not turning back, just adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, a small, ordinary motion that grounded everything that had just happened in something real, something human. And then she kept walking, disappearing into the flow of the street like a drop of water returning to a river. And Hayes finally spoke, his voice low, more to himself than anyone else. Someone we should have recognized sooner. And the words did not carry regret alone. They carried understanding, the kind that comes quietly, but stays, long after the moment itself has passed. The lights were still flashing, but they no longer felt urgent, just repetitive, like something left on too long after the moment had passed. And Hayes stood there a few seconds longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on the space where Ava had disappeared, as if expecting something to pull her back into view, some explanation, some confirmation that what had just happened fit into a system he understood. But nothing came, just the low hum of engines, the distant sound of traffic moving through the intersection, and the quiet shift of people returning to their routines. And that was the part that unsettled him most. Not the confrontation, not the precision of her movements, but how quickly the world absorbed it, how easily it moved on while he remained standing in the same spot, still processing something that refused to simplify. We need to report this, Mercer said finally, his voice lower now, no longer sharp, no longer certain, just searching for structure, for something that could put boundaries around what had happened. And Hayes nodded slightly, though his attention remained elsewhere, replaying the details in his mind, the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way she chose not to escalate when she could have. And each time he revisited it, the same conclusion surfaced, quiet but firm. They had misjudged her from the very beginning, not because they lacked information, but because they had already decided what to see. And that realization stayed with him as he reached for his radio, his thumb hovering for a second before pressing down. Unit 12, situation resolved, he said, his voice steady, controlled, but different now, stripped of the confidence that came from assumption, replaced by something more measured, more aware. And the response crackled back almost immediately, routine, procedural, asking for details that he could not easily compress into a few sentences, because what had happened was not just an event, it was a shift, and shifts do not fit neatly into reports. They linger, they reshape, they follow you long after the scene is cleared. And Mercer glanced toward the edge of the lot again, as if hoping to catch one last glimpse. But there was nothing there now, just a stream of people moving through their day, unaware of how close they had come to witnessing something far different, something that could have gone another way entirely. And he exhaled, slower this time, She just walked, he said quietly, almost to himself, and Hayes heard the weight in it. Not confusion anymore, but recognition, because walking away had not been an escape, it had been a choice, deliberate, controlled, and that choice carried more authority than anything they had tried to impose. And Hayes turned, finally stepping away from the spot where it all unfolded, his boots moving across the pavement with a different awareness, each step grounded, deliberate, as if he were recalibrating how he moved through spaces like this. And as he reached the vehicle, he paused for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle, the metal cool under his palm, reflecting the last flickers of red and blue light. And in that reflection, he saw not just himself, but the gap between what he thought he knew and what he had just learned, and it stayed there, quiet, undeniable, a reminder that not every situation is what it appears to be, and not every person fits the role assigned to them. And as the lights finally dimmed, fading into the ordinary glow of the street, Hayes opened the door and stepped inside, carrying that understanding with him, knowing it would not fade as easily as the scene behind him. Because some moments do not end when they are over, they continue, reshaping everything that comes after. The engine started with a low, steady hum, but Hayes did not pull away right away, his hands resting on the steering wheel, as if the motion of leaving required more than just turning the key, because something in him was still anchored to that moment, replaying it in fragments. The stillness, the voice, the way everything had shifted without force, and beside him, Mercer sat quieter than before, his usual edge dulled, replaced by something closer to thought, something heavier than frustration. And for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the silence inside the vehicle mirroring the one that had settled outside after she left, not empty, but full of something unresolved. "You felt that, right?" Mercer said finally, his voice low, almost reluctant, like admitting it gave it more weight, and Hayes did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her there again, walking back into frame, offering some explanation that would make sense of it all, but the street behind them was already ordinary, just headlights passing, people moving, nothing that marked what had just happened as anything more than a brief interruption, and that contrast pressed into him again, the idea that something significant could occur and leave so little visible trace. "She was not reacting," Hayes said after a moment, choosing his words carefully, not because he lacked them, but because none of them felt complete. "She was waiting." And Mercer let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, his eyes fixed forward now. "Waiting for what?" he asked, but the question lingered, unanswered, because the truth was, they both knew the answer was not simple, not something that could be reduced to a single reason or a single moment. And Hayes adjusted his grip on the wheel, the leather warm under his palms, grounding him in the present even as his mind remained somewhere behind them. And then he shifted the car into drive, easing forward slowly, the tires rolling over the same pavement where minutes ago everything had felt charged, uncertain, and now it was just a road again, just another exit from another call, and yet nothing about it felt routine, not anymore. Because the memory of her presence lingered, not as an image, but as a feeling, controlled, precise, unshaken, and it followed him as they turned onto the street, merging into the flow of traffic, where everything moved at a steady pace, predictable, structured, and for the first time that structure felt incomplete, like it left something out, something he had never needed to account for before. "You think she is some kind of federal?" Mercer asked, the words careful, stripped of the earlier tone, and Hayes glanced at him briefly before returning his focus to the road, the streetlights passing in measured intervals, casting brief shadows across the dashboard. "I think," he said slowly, "we assumed too much too early." And Mercer nodded once, small, almost to himself, because that part, at least, was undeniable now, and as they drove farther away, the scene behind them faded completely, replaced by the steady rhythm of the city at night. But the shift it had created did not fade with it. It stayed, subtle but persistent, altering the way Hayes watched the road, the way he processed each passing detail, each person on the sidewalk, each face briefly illuminated by streetlight, because now there was a question beneath it all, quiet but constant, asking what else had been overlooked, what else had been misread, and somewhere ahead, a traffic light turned yellow, then red, and Hayes slowed, bringing the car to a stop, the engine idling softly as the city moved around them. And for a brief moment, everything held again, not tense, not urgent, just still. And in that stillness, he realized something he had not fully allowed himself to consider before, that the moment had not ended when she walked away. It had only shifted, extending into everything that came after, and the light changed, green cutting through the pause. And Hayes pressed the accelerator, moving forward, carrying that realization with him into whatever came next. The city lights stretched ahead in long, unbroken lines, glowing against the windshield like something steady, predictable, and yet Hayes could not shake the feeling that something beneath that order had shifted, something subtle but permanent. And as the vehicle moved through the late evening traffic, he found himself watching more closely than before, not just the road, but the people, the spaces between them, the quiet details that used to blur together into routine, because now each one carried the possibility of being more than it appeared. And Mercer shifted in his seat again, glancing at the dashboard, then out the window, then back at Hayes, like he was still trying to place what had happened into something that made sense. "We should run her," he said after a moment, his voice careful, less certain than it had ever been. And Hayes nodded slightly, already reaching toward the console, not out of habit this time, but out of a need to understand, to confirm what instinct had already begun to tell him. And the screen flickered to life, casting a soft blue glow across the interior, reflecting faintly in his eyes as he entered what little information they had, the time, the location, the interaction, each detail feeling incomplete on its own, and the system processed quietly, almost too quietly, like it was deciding something before responding. And for a second, the car felt smaller, the hum of the engine louder, the air heavier, and then the screen updated, not with a full file, not with the kind of report they were used to, but with a flag, a restricted notice that replaced details with absence. And Hayes stared at it, his hand still resting near the console, his breath slowing as the realization settled in, not sudden, but steady, undeniable. "What is that?" Mercer asked, leaning slightly closer, trying to make sense of the limited information. And Hayes did not answer right away, because the meaning of it was already clear, even if the details were not. And that clarity carried more weight than any report could have. "It means," Hayes said finally, his voice low, measured, "we were never supposed to be the ones asking questions." And Mercer leaned back, the words landing heavier than expected, because they confirmed something he had begun to suspect but had not wanted to accept, that the situation had never belonged to them, not from the start. And outside, the traffic continued moving, steady, indifferent, unaware of the shift happening inside the vehicle. And Hayes glanced at the screen one more time before turning it off, letting the darkness settle back in, because whatever answer it held was not meant to be explored further, not by them. And that understanding came with an unexpected sense of calm, not relief, but clarity, the kind that removes the need to push, to control, to define. And Mercer exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting forward again. "So what do we do now?" he asked. And Hayes kept his eyes on the road, the lines of the highway stretching ahead, illuminated in brief flashes by passing lights. "We move on," he said, but the words carried something more than routine. They carried acceptance. And as the car continued forward, merging into the steady flow of the city, the moment behind them no longer felt unresolved. It felt complete in a way that did not require explanation. Because some truths are not meant to be uncovered through force or authority, they reveal themselves quietly, in the space between assumption and reality. And as Hayes drove on, that space stayed with him, reshaping how he saw everything that came into view. Each passing face, each quiet figure on the sidewalk, each moment that seemed ordinary, because now he understood, not everything is what it appears to be, and sometimes the person you overlook is the one who was never meant to be seen until it mattered most. The road stretched farther into the night, but something in the rhythm had changed, not in the traffic, not in the lights, but in the way Hayes held the wheel, in the way his eyes no longer skimmed past details but settled on them, one by one, as if each carried a question he had not been asking before. And the silence inside the vehicle was no longer empty. It was reflective, shaped by everything they had just processed, everything they had chosen not to pursue further. And Mercer shifted. Again, less restless now, more thoughtful, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. "So that is it?" he asked, not challenging, not dismissing, just trying to define the edge of something that refused to be boxed in. And Hayes kept his gaze forward, watching the lane markers pass in steady intervals, white lines appearing and disappearing beneath the headlights like a quiet metronome. "That is it," he said, but the words carried more weight than closure. They carried restraint, the kind that does not come from being told to stop, but from knowing when to. And Mercer nodded slowly, absorbing that, not fully agreeing, not fully resisting, just letting it settle. And outside, the city continued as it always did, storefronts closing, late-night traffic thinning, people moving through their routines unaware that anything had shifted at all, and yet inside the vehicle, something had. Something subtle, but lasting, and Hayes felt it most in the questions he did not ask, the ones he chose to leave alone, because not every answer needed to be uncovered, not every truth needed to be claimed, and that realization grounded him in a way he had not expected, because it did not take away his authority, it clarified it, narrowed it to what actually mattered. And as they approached another intersection, the light turned yellow again, casting a soft glow across the dashboard, and Hayes slowed without thinking, easing into the stop, the engine idling quietly as the moment stretched just long enough for him to notice the reflection in the glass ahead, not just his own face, but the faint outline of Mercer beside him, both of them still, both of them changed in ways neither would fully articulate, and for a brief second, the image of Ava surfaced again in his mind, not as a confrontation, not as a disruption, but as a presence, steady, controlled, unshaken, and he realized that what stayed with him was not what she had done, but what she had chosen not to do, the restraint, the precision, the quiet certainty that had guided every movement, every word, and that was what shifted everything, not force, not conflict, but control. And the light turned green, breaking the pause, and Hayes pressed the accelerator, the car moving forward smoothly, rejoining the flow of the city, and Mercer looked ahead, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "We would not have known," he said, and Hayes nodded once, because that part was true. They would not have known, not without pushing too far, not without crossing a line that did not belong to them. And as they drove on, the road stretching out in front of them once again, Hayes felt a quiet sense of alignment settle in, not resolution, not closure, but understanding, the kind that does not demand answers, just changes the way you move forward. And in that understanding, the moment behind them no longer felt like something unfinished. It felt complete in its own way, a line drawn not by authority, but by awareness. And as the city lights continued to pass by, steady and unbroken, Hayes kept driving, carrying that awareness with him, knowing it would shape what came next in ways he would not fully see until it mattered again. The highway opened up ahead, wider now, less crowded, the lanes stretching into long bands of light under the glow of overhead lamps. And Hayes felt the difference immediately, not just in the road, but in the quiet that came with it, the kind that gives space for thoughts that usually get buried under motion and noise. And he let the car settle into a steady speed, the engine smoothing out as the city began to fall behind them, its reflections fading in the rearview mirror until they became just scattered points of light. And beside him Mercer leaned back further into his seat, his posture no longer tense, no longer searching for something to fix, just still, like he had finally stopped trying to resolve something that did not need resolution. "You ever seen anything like that?" Mercer asked after a while, his voice low, almost cautious, like the question itself carried weight. And Hayes did not answer right away, not because he did not have an answer, but because he was considering how to frame it, how to say something that felt complete when the moment itself had been anything but simple. And the road hummed softly beneath them, the tires moving over smooth asphalt in a steady rhythm that matched the pace of his thoughts. "No," he said finally, his voice even but quieter than before, "not like that." And Mercer nodded once, his eyes fixed forward, watching the road the same way Hayes had started to, more aware, more deliberate, as if every passing detail might carry meaning now. And the silence returned, but it felt different this time, not heavy, not unresolved, just reflective, like a pause between something that had already changed and something that had not happened yet. and Hayes adjusted his grip on the wheel slightly, the leather warm under his hands, grounding him in the present even as his mind moved back through the earlier moments. The stillness, the clarity, the choice, and he realized that what stayed with him most was not the shift in power, but the restraint behind it, the fact that she had never needed to prove anything beyond what was necessary, never pushed further than the moment required, and that kind of control was not common, not even among those trained for it. It was something deeper, something internal, and Mercer spoke again, softer now. She could have made it worse, he said, and Hayes nodded without looking over. Because that part was undeniable. She chose not to, he replied, and the words settled into the space between them. Simple, but significant, because they reframed everything that had happened, not as a confrontation, but as a decision, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. And as they drove on, the highway stretching farther into the dark, Hayes felt a quiet shift in how he understood authority itself, not as something that needed to be asserted at every moment, but as something that required awareness, restraint, and the ability to recognize when a situation extended beyond its reach. And that realization did not weaken it. It refined it, made it more precise, more grounded, and ahead of them, a long curve in the road came into view, the lane markers bending gently to the right, guiding the flow of traffic in a smooth, continuous motion, and Hayes followed it without hesitation, his movements steady, aligned. And for the first time since the moment began, there was no tension left in his chest, no unresolved question pressing forward, just a quiet understanding that not every encounter is meant to be controlled, some are meant to be recognized. And as the car continued along the curve, merging seamlessly into the path ahead, Hayes carried that understanding with him, knowing that the next time a moment like that appeared, it would not look the same, but he would see it differently, and that difference would matter. The curve of the highway straightened into a long stretch of open road, the kind that seemed to go on without interruption, and the steady hum of the engine blended with the low rhythm of tires against asphalt, creating a quiet backdrop that no longer felt heavy but reflective, like the space after something important has already been understood. And Hayes kept his eyes forward, not scanning anymore, not searching, just observing with a clarity that had not been there before. And Mercer shifted slightly in his seat, his posture relaxed now, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet acceptance that did not need to be spoken aloud. And for a while neither of them said anything, the silence no longer demanding to be filled, just existing as part of the moment. And outside, the highway lights passed in steady intervals, each one briefly illuminating the interior of the car before fading behind them, like markers of time rather than urgency. And Hayes felt something settle into place within him, not a conclusion, not a resolution, but a recalibration, the kind that changes how you interpret everything that comes after without announcing itself. And he realized that what had happened earlier was not just an encounter, it was a mirror, reflecting something back at him that had always been there, but had never been examined closely, the assumptions, the patterns, the quiet decisions made in seconds that shaped entire outcomes. And now that mirror had shifted, not shattered, just adjusted enough to reveal a different angle, one that required more attention, more care, and more awareness than before. And Mercer finally spoke again, his voice softer, almost thoughtful. "You think we will run into her again?" he asked, and the question hung in the air, not driven by curiosity alone, but by something deeper, a recognition that some encounters do not feel finished even when they are. And Hayes considered it for a moment, not because he expected an answer, but because the question itself mattered, and he shook his head slightly. "I do not think that is the point," he said, his tone calm, steady, and Mercer nodded slowly, understanding that what they had experienced was not about repetition, not about seeing it again, but about what it had already changed. And the road continued ahead, uninterrupted, the dark horizon stretching beyond the reach of their headlights. And Hayes adjusted his speed slightly, not out of necessity, but out of awareness, maintaining a balance that felt deliberate rather than automatic. And as they drove, the city was now far behind them, replaced by open space and quiet distance. And in that distance, the earlier moment felt clearer, not louder, not more intense, just more defined, like something that had settled into its true shape once the noise around it faded. And Hayes glanced briefly at the dashboard, the soft glow of the controls reflecting faintly in his vision, steady and consistent, and he realized that clarity did not come from knowing everything. It came from recognizing what you did not need to control, and that realization stayed with him, grounding him in a way that felt both new and familiar at the same time. And Mercer leaned his head back slightly, exhaling. Slowly, no longer trying to revisit the moment, just letting it rest where it belonged, and the car moved forward, steady and aligned, carrying both of them into the next stretch of road, where nothing looked different, nothing stood out, and yet everything felt just slightly more defined, as if the world itself had not changed, but the way they saw it had shifted just enough to matter. The road continued forward without interruption, a long ribbon of asphalt stretching into the quiet horizon, and for the first time that night, there was nothing left to process, nothing left to question, just the steady rhythm of movement and the soft glow of headlights cutting through the dark, and Hayes kept his hands on the wheel, firm but relaxed, his posture settled into something that felt both familiar and new, like a habit that had been adjusted in a way he could not fully articulate. And beside him Mercer remained quiet, not out of uncertainty anymore, but out of understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real, and the silence between them no longer carried weight, it carried clarity, and as the miles passed, the earlier moment no longer replayed in fragments. It settled into a single, complete image, not of conflict, not of authority, but of stillness, of someone standing in the center of pressure and choosing not to let it define her, and that image stayed with Hayes, not as a disruption, but as a reference, something to measure against in moments that would come later, moments that might look different but carry the same underlying question. And he realized that what had changed was not the world around him, not the systems or the structure he operated within, but the way he saw the space between them, the space where assumptions form, where decisions are made before facts are fully understood. And now that space felt clearer, more visible, something he could no longer ignore. And as the highway signs began to appear ahead, marking exits and distances in clean, reflective lettering, Hayes felt a quiet sense of direction settle in, not tied to the road itself, but to the way he would move through moments like that from now on, with more awareness, more restraint, and more willingness to pause before defining what he saw. And Mercer finally shifted slightly, glancing out at the open road before speaking in a tone that carried no tension, only reflection. "She did not need to prove anything," he said, and Hayes nodded once, because that was the truth of it, the part that mattered most. "No," he replied quietly, "she did not." And the simplicity of it held more weight than anything else they had said, because it captured the essence of what they had witnessed, not power asserted, not authority challenged, but something deeper, something grounded in certainty that did not rely on recognition to exist. And as the car moved past another set of lights, the reflections sliding across the windshield in smooth, passing waves, Hayes felt that understanding settle fully into place, not as a lesson, not as a correction, but as a shift, subtle but permanent. And ahead, the road opened even further, the horizon clear, unobstructed, and he guided the vehicle forward without hesitation. The motion steady, aligned, and in that movement there was no urgency, no tension, just a quiet continuation, the kind that carries something forward without needing to explain it. And behind them, the moment was gone, absorbed into the flow of everything else, but its impact remained, not visible, not spoken, just present, shaping the way forward in ways that would only be understood when it mattered again. And as the night stretched on and the road carried them farther into the distance, Hayes did not look back, because he did not need to. The shift had already happened, and it was enough.